The RMS Titanic, a luxury steamship, sank in the early hours of April 15, 1912, off the coast of Newfoundland in the North Atlantic after sideswiping an iceberg during its maiden voyage. Of the 2,240 passengers and crew on board, more than 1,500 lost their lives in the disaster. Titanic has inspired countless books, articles, and films. Before we start our story, if you are new to my channel, please subscribe and don't forget to like the videos so that you're always updated on my new uploaded videos. The Titanic was a luxury British liner that sank in the early hours of April 15, 1912 after colliding with an iceberg, killing over 1,500 passengers and crew members. After sideswiping an iceberg on its maiden voyage, the RMS Titanic perished off the coast of Newfoundland in the North Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912. Around 1,500 of the 2,240 passengers and crew members on board died in the crash. The narrative of the Titanic has been the topic of countless books, essays, and films, most notably the 1997 film Titanic, starring Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio, and it has become a cautionary tale about the risks of human hubris. In the early 20th century, the Titanic was the consequence of severe competition between competing maritime companies. Cunard, a renowned British firm with two prominent ships that were among the most sophisticated and opulent of their time, was competing with the White Star Line for steamship supremacy. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat torpedo, killing roughly 1,200 of the 1,959 passengers on board and leading the United States to enter World War I. The construction of the second of these three ocean liners, Titanic, began in March 1909 at Belfast's Harland and Wolff shipyard and lasted for 2 years. The ship's hull was immediately transported to a massive fitting-out dock, where tens of thousands of employees worked for the next year to build the ship's decks, luxurious interiors, and the 29 massive boilers that would power her two main steam engines. The Olympic-class ships had a double bottom and 15 watertight bulkhead compartments with electric watertight doors that could be operated by a switch from the bridge. However, while the individual bulkheads were watertight, the walls dividing them only extended a few feet above the sea line, allowing water to flow from one compartment to another, especially if the ship began to list or pitch forward. The Titanic's insufficient number of lifeboats was the second critical safety flaw that resulted in the deaths of so many people. Titanic could transport up to 2,435 passengers, and a crew of about 900 individuals increased the ship's capacity to almost 3,300. As a result, even if the lifeboats were fully loaded during an emergency evacuation, only one-third of the passengers could board. Despite being grossly inadequate by today's standards, the Titanic's number of lifeboats actually exceeded the British Board of Trade's specifications. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic set sail for the first time from Southampton, England, causing quite a stir. After stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, now known as Cobite, Ireland, the ship set sail for New York with 2,240 passengers and crew or souls, as the phrase was used in the maritime business at the time, often in connection with a sinking on board. Isidor Straus, the elderly owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida, industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim, accompanied by his mistress, valet, and chauffeur, and widow and heiress Margaret Molly Brown, who earned the nickname the Unsinkable Molly Brown by assisting in the loading of the lifeboats and boosting the spirits of her fellow survivors. For shipping lines like White Star, third-class passengers were the main source of profit, and Titanic was built to provide them with rooms and amenities that were superior than those found on any other ship at the time. According to a theory proposed by a small group of Titanic experts, the fire became uncontrollable after the ship left Southampton, forcing the crew to attempt a full-speed crossing. Moving at such a fast speed, they were unable to avoid colliding with the iceberg, which resulted in the ship sinking. When the Titanic sailed away from Southampton's pier, another unsettling thing occurred. Superstitious Titanic fans typically regard this as the worst kind of portent for a ship embarking on its first voyage. On April 14, Titanic heard sporadic reports of ice from other ships after 4 days of delightful sailing, but she was cruising on smooth seas under a moonless, bright sky. The engines were swiftly reversed, and the ship was sharply turned rather than colliding with the berg head-on. Titanic appeared to skim along the berg's side, scattering ice chunks over the forward deck. When the skipper investigated the damaged section with Harland and Wolff's Thomas Andrews, 5 compartments were already filled with seawater, and the bow of the fatal ship was ominously slanted downward, allowing seawater to rush from one bulkhead into the following compartment. Andrews calculated quickly and anticipated that the Titanic would float for an hour and a half, or a little longer. After instructing his wireless operator to call for assistance, the skipper ordered the lifeboats to be loaded. With the lowering of the first lifeboat a little more than an hour after impact with the iceberg, a highly unorganized and unplanned evacuation began. Sadly, this was to become the norm. In the frenzied hours running up to the Titanic's sinking, nearly every lifeboat was miserably underfilled, with some carrying only a handful of passengers. Titanic stayed afloat for about 3 hours, exceeding Andrews' projection. Hundreds of human dramas unfolded between the order to fill the lifeboats and the ship's fatal dive. Men were separated from their wives and children, families were split up in the chaos, and selfless passengers gave up their seats to stay with loved ones or allow a more vulnerable passenger to escape. In the end, 706 people were saved from the Titanic's sinking. The Titanic's famous passengers all reacted to the circumstance in ways that have since become part of the Titanic folklore. Ismay, White Star's managing director, helped load some of the boats and later went into a collapsible as it was being lowered. Despite the fact that there were no women or children on board when he abandoned ship, he could never forgive himself for escaping the tragedy while so many others died. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's chief designer, was last seen staring blankly at a ship picture on the wall in the first-class smoking room. Molly Brown assisted in the loading of the boats and was eventually forced to board one of the last to go. Cunard's Carpathia recovered all of the lifeboats throughout the morning after hearing Titanic's distress signal at midnight and steaming at full speed while skirting ice floes all night. At least 5 independent boards of inquiry performed thorough hearings on the Titanic's sinking on both sides of the Atlantic, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and meeting with many maritime experts. While it has long been assumed that the ship sank as a result of the gash that flooded the bulkhead compartments, other theories have emerged over time, including the ship's steel plates being too brittle for the near-freezing Atlantic waters, the impact causing rivets to pop, and the expansion joints failing, among others. The Titanic's designers believed they had designed an indestructible ship that could not be sunk by natural forces, and many people see the disaster as a cautionary tale about the dangers of human arrogance. According to reports, the ship collided with an iceberg but remained afloat and was being pulled to dock with everyone on board. According to marine historian John Maxtoney Graham, the Titanic's story has been paralleled to the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986.